What would you do if the man you trusted most shattered your dignity in a single night, leaving you unemployed, humiliated, and pregnant with twins? This is the story of Evelyn Carter, a young woman who went from being a secretary cast aside with a $75,000 check to becoming the CEO of a $1 billion empire. A story of betrayal, resilience, and a mother's unshakable love. 5 years after Richard Hale, a wealthy heir and corporate titan, fired her in disgrace, Evelyn walked back into his world not as the woman he dismissed, but as his equal and his reckoning. How did a single mother, juggling night shifts and diaper changes, build a company strong enough to topple the man who once destroyed her? What happens when two little girls, with eyes identical to his, stand in front of Richard and ask the question he can't escape? Are you our daddy? This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about justice, legacy, and the power of knowing your own worth. If you believe in resilience, love, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's begin. Evelyn Carter's extraordinary journey. The air inside the ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and champagne bubbles. It was one of those evenings where every surface seemed polished to perfection, where every voice carried the confident ease of people born into privilege. Harrison Industries, the century-old medical supply empire, was hosting its annual gala in downtown Boston. The Harrison name was etched into hospital wings and research centers across the East Coast. And at the very top of it all stood Richard Hale, the young CEO who wore his wealth like a tailored suit, expensive, comfortable, unquestioned. At the edge of that glittering world stood Evelyn Carter. She was 27, a secretary in the logistics division, hired 2 years earlier after a string of forgettable office jobs. She had grown up in a small Massachusetts town, where her father's hands were always stained with engine grease and her mother worked night shifts at a diner. Evelyn had no legacy, no money, no connections. What she did have was competence. She typed faster than anyone in her department, remembered schedules down to the minute, and had a calm voice that soothed impatient clients. It was enough to keep her steady, but never enough to make her visible until that night. Richard noticed her at the gala. She had been sent to help coordinate name tags and seating arrangements. He walked past, his glass of wine half raised, his tie slightly undone, and for one brief moment, their eyes locked. Evelyn wasn't used to being looked at that way by men like him. Later, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, he found her again near the service corridor, balancing a tray of abandoned glasses she'd offered to help the catering staff carry. He said something light, almost teasing. She laughed, surprised at herself. One moment bled into another until she found herself in his hotel suite hours later, the city lights spilling through tall windows as if to remind her she didn't belong there. It wasn't love. It wasn't even romance. It was impulse, loneliness, and the dangerous flattery of being chosen by someone who usually never looked down at the people beneath his world. The next morning, he thanked her with a kind of polite detachment, the way one thanks a stranger for holding open a door. She tried to convince herself it meant more. She carried that fragile illusion into the following weeks, waiting for a call, a message, anything. None came. When the nausea started, she thought it was stress. When her period never arrived, she bought the test in secret, hiding it under grocery bags. 2 pink lines appeared, clear as day. She sat on the bathroom floor of her small apartment, the tile cold beneath her legs, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the stick. She whispered, "No, no, no," over and over. But denial doesn't erase truth. She was pregnant. Evelyn didn't want to believe the worst of Richard, but she also couldn't imagine raising a child alone. Heart pounding, she scheduled a meeting with him at headquarters. She rehearsed the words in her head. "I need to talk to you about something important." But when she was finally ushered into his office, a gleaming space of glass walls and leather chairs, her courage faltered. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, his silence stretched long enough to crush whatever fragile hope she'd carried in. Then, Calmly, he said, "This position isn't the right fit for you anymore." Two security guards arrived within minutes. Evelyn's computer access was revoked, her desk already being cleared. She stood there in disbelief, her ID badge still hanging from her neck, while her colleagues avoided her eyes. No explanation, no conversation, no chance to defend herself. She left the building carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photos, pens, and the potted plant she'd kept by her desk. Outside, the Boston sky had turned gray, and the rain fell hard, soaking her thin coat. She walked down the street with her belongings pressing into her arms, the weight of humiliation heavier than the box itself. That evening, an envelope was slid under her apartment door. Inside was a check for $75,000, signed by Richard himself. No note, no explanation, just the number, as if her dignity, her child, her entire life could be itemized and solved with money. Evelyn stared at it for a long time, her jaw tight, her eyes burning. Then she folded it back into the envelope and shoved it deep inside a drawer. She wouldn't cash it. She couldn't. Accepting it would mean accepting his verdict on what she and her child were worth. That night, she lay in bed unable to sleep. The rain tapped against the window like an accusation. She thought of her father, gone since she was 16, a man who had nothing but gave everything to his family. She thought of her mother, her health declining, still working nights because there was no other choice. And she thought of the tiny life inside her, unasked for, but already undeniable. Evelyn pressed a hand to her stomach and whispered, "I don't know how we'll make it, but I promise I won't let the world throw us away." It was a promise born not of confidence, but of desperation. She didn't know about the sleepless nights ahead, the hunger, the fear, the loneliness that would gnaw at her resolve. She only knew that walking away from that office, drenched in rain, stripped of her livelihood, had burned something into her soul. The girl who had once believed in fair chances was gone. What remained was a woman who would learn to fight, not for revenge, not even for herself, but for the two heartbeats she carried beneath her own. The fall was complete, but sometimes the lowest point is also the place where foundations are laid. The pregnancy test lay on the bathroom counter like an accusation she couldn't escape. Evelyn Carter had already known the answer before she bought it. The fatigue, the morning sickness, the way her body felt different, it all pointed in one direction. But seeing the pink lines appear so quickly, so vividly, left no room for denial. She sat on the edge of the tub, the silence of her apartment pressing down on her, and let the reality sink in. She was pregnant with Richard Harrison's child. At first, shock hollowed her out. She had no job, no savings worth mentioning, and no partner willing to stand beside her. Richard had made that brutally clear. She thought about calling her mother, but her mother's health was fragile, and Evelyn couldn't bring herself to add more worry. So, she carried the secret alone, whispering to herself, "It's just me now. Just me." 2 weeks later, during her first appointment at a small community clinic, the doctor confirmed what she hadn't expected. "Twins," the woman said, smiling as if it were good news. Evelyn's heart clenched. Twins, 2 babies, 2 lives growing inside her at once. She left the clinic with a stack of pamphlets and a hollow feeling in her chest. How could she manage 1 baby, let alone 2? That night, another envelope appeared at her door. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Inside, another check. The exact same one she'd shoved into her drawer weeks earlier, $75,000. A typed note accompanied it this time. Only a single line, "Take care of this quietly." Evelyn's hands shook as she read the words. To him, her children were nothing but an inconvenience, a problem to be solved with money. Her throat burned with humiliation and rage. She tore the note into tiny pieces, but she couldn't tear out the ache it left inside. For days she drifted through a fog of fear. Rent was due. Groceries were dwindling. She worked shifts at a diner until her legs ached, then came home and cried quietly into her pillow. The voices in her head argued without pause. "You can't do this alone. It's impossible." Then another voice, quieter but steadier. They're your babies. They deserve a chance. One afternoon, when the nausea was particularly bad, she found herself standing outside a clinic that performed abortions. She had walked there without realizing, her feet carrying her to the door, while her mind replayed every practical reason to go inside. She stared at the glass door for a long time. All it would take was one signature, one procedure, and the crushing weight of fear would lift. She could go back to being invisible, to working quietly, to surviving. No one would ever know. But then her hand rested on her stomach, and she felt the faintest flutter. It wasn't much, probably just nerves. The doctor had said, but it was enough. Tears filled her eyes. "I can't," she whispered aloud, shaking her head. "I can't erase them." She turned and walked away, her knees weak but her decision firm. That night, Evelyn took out her father's old Bible, the one he used to keep in the glove compartment of his rusted pickup truck. She hadn't opened it in years, but now her hands clung to it like a lifeline. Sitting at the small kitchen table, she made a vow not to God, not to Richard, but to herself and the children growing inside her. "I don't know how," she whispered into the silence, her voice trembling. "I don't know where the money will come from or what tomorrow will look like. But I promise you, I will protect you. I will fight for you. And I will never, ever let you feel unwanted." The promise felt bigger than her, heavier than anything she had ever carried, but it also lit a spark inside her. For the first time since losing her job, Evelyn felt a strange kind of strength. It wasn't confidence. It was something deeper, resolve born of desperation. The days that followed were brutal. Morning sickness hit her in waves, leaving her bent over the sink while the alarm clock screamed that she was late for work. Her shifts at the diner grew harder as her uniform tightened around her waist. The manager started making comments about reliability. Customers glanced at her stomach with judgment she wasn't ready to face. Each day felt like a test she barely passed. At night, she worked at a second job, entering data for a small insurance office. She sat hunched over her laptop in her dim apartment, typing until her eyes blurred. Sometimes she fell asleep at the table, her head resting on the keyboard, jolted awake by the buzzing of her cheap alarm clock. She'd stumble to bed, too tired even to change her clothes. Through it all, the envelope with the check remained in the drawer, untouched. On the hardest nights, she would open it and stare at the number, imagining what it could buy months of rent, medical bills covered, a cushion of safety. But every time she pictured cashing it, she saw Richard's face, the smug detachment, the dismissal in his eyes, and she slammed the drawer shut. Taking that money would mean agreeing with him, agreeing that her children were a mistake best erased. And she refused. Winter settled over Boston with its usual bite. Evelyn wrapped her coat tighter and walked carefully over icy sidewalks, one hand always on her belly. Her body changed quickly with twins, her reflection in the mirror both foreign and strangely beautiful. Some nights, she pressed her palms to her stomach and whispered to the babies inside, telling them stories about her father's workshop, about her mother's stubborn laugh, about a life where they would never be made to feel small. There were still nights she broke down, sobbing into her pillow, wondering if she was strong enough. But each morning she rose, tied her apron, and kept going. She had no other choice. Survival wasn't about dignity anymore. It was about keeping the promise she had made that no matter how hard it got, she would not abandon them. By the time spring thawed the sidewalks, Evelyn had accepted her reality. She wasn't just a secretary who had lost her job. She wasn't a woman defined by a mistake with a powerful man. She was a mother, twice over, and those two lives gave her a reason to endure. Rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the foundation where she would start building, brick by brick, a life no one, not even Richard Harrison, could ever take away again. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew when Evelyn first unlocked the door. It was on the second floor of a sagging 3-story building in a worn-down part of Somerville, just outside Boston. The rent was low enough to be almost affordable, which was the only reason she could take it. The wallpaper peeled in spots. The radiator hissed like an angry animal, and the single bedroom barely fit a mattress and crib. But to Evelyn, standing in the doorway with a box of thrift store dishes balanced on her hip, it was more than just walls. It was shelter. It was a place to try and begin again. Each day soon blurred into a routine of exhaustion. By sunrise, she was already on her feet, slipping into a faded uniform at the corner diner. She carried plates of pancakes and mugs of weak coffee to truck drivers and construction workers, smiling when her swollen ankles begged her to sit. The tips were meager, sometimes just a handful of coins left on the counter, but every cent mattered. After 8 hours on her feet, she trudged home, changed quickly, and logged onto her laptop for the second job entering medical codes for an insurance office. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was remote and paid by the hour. She typed steadily into the night, her back aching, her belly pressing against the table's edge as the twins grew. Money was always short. Evelyn developed rituals around stretching every dollar. She clipped coupons, scoured clearance racks, and carried a notebook filled with calculations, rent due, bus fare, grocery list, pared down to the essentials. At the corner market, she often stood in the aisle, counting loose quarters in her hand before deciding whether she could afford both milk and eggs that week. Sometimes she skipped meals so she could save enough to buy prenatal vitamins. The hunger gnawed at her, but the thought of the twins gave her strength. They come first. She repeated like a mantra. The exhaustion was bone deep. Many nights she would place her old laptop on the kitchen table and try to watch the instructional videos from an online coding course she'd enrolled in. The words swam across the screen as her eyelids drooped. More than once she woke at 3 a.m, cheek pressed to the keyboard, the imprint of keys etched into her skin. She'd jolt awake, panic that she had lost precious minutes of work, then start again until dawn broke and her alarm signaled another day at the diner. And yet, beneath the grind, a small ember of hope burned. In the drawer beside her bed was a weathered spiral notebook, its cover bent, pages filled with cramped handwriting. Whenever a thought came to here, a better way to organize patient records, a system to reduce medical errors, a shortcut for hospitals drowning in paperwork. She scribbled it down. She named the idea MediTrack, though it was only sketches and concepts. To anyone else, it would have looked like random notes, arrows, and boxes. But to Evelyn, it was a map out of despair, a reminder that her mind still had value even when her body felt broken. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was quiet, she imagined a future where MediTrack existed, a program hospitals actually used, a company with her name on the door. It felt impossible, almost laughable. What could a single mother with no degree, no investors, no support possibly build? But the thought gave her something to hold on to, something beyond the daily struggle of surviving one shift at a time. Her neighbors saw her as quiet, hardworking, polite. They didn't see the way she cried silently in the shower when the hot water ran out too soon, or the way she whispered to her unborn daughters about the world she wanted for them. She'd press a hand to her belly and murmur, "I don't know how yet, but I promise you'll never feel invisible. You'll never be discarded like I was." The weight of those words steadied her when fear threatened to consume her. Because the truth was, Evelyn often wondered if she could make it. She worried about medical bills, about whether the babies would be healthy, about what kind of mother she would be when she was already so tired she could barely stand. But then she remembered the humiliation of that rainy afternoon outside Harrison Industries, clutching her box of belongings, and anger fueled her resolve. She refused to let that moment define her entire life. Small kindnesses kept her afloat. The elderly landlady sometimes slipped a basket of day-old bread rolls outside her door. A fellow waitress shared tips on how to stretch leftovers into full meals. These gestures reminded Evelyn that not everyone viewed her as a burden. Even so, she learned quickly not to expect much from others. Independence became her armor, necessity, her teacher. The seasons changed. The cracked windows of the apartment let in blasts of cold air in January, and Evelyn layered blankets over her growing belly, shivering but determined. By March, as the snow began to melt, she found herself slowing down more often, forced to take breaks at work when her back screamed in protest. Customers complained when she forgot an order or dropped a fork. The manager sighed loudly, muttering about hiring someone more reliable. She swallowed her pride and kept showing up, because losing that job wasn't an option. Through every setback, the notebook grew heavier with ideas. Sometimes she filled whole pages during bus rides, balancing it on her knees as she scribbled furiously. She wrote about user-friendly interfaces, automated reminders for prescriptions, safeguards against fraud. The vision became clearer, more detailed, more possible. When doubt crept in, she reminded herself that innovation often came from people who saw problems firsthand. And she had lived those problems, seeing doctors rush paperwork, watching nurses drown in data. If anyone could design a better system, why not me? By the time spring arrived, Evelyn's belly was round and firm, her steps slower, her fatigue constant. Yet her spirit felt strangely stronger. She had endured months of scarcity, of humiliation, of doubt, and she was still standing. She had two lives inside her, a drawer full of scribbled dreams and a determination carved from struggle. She didn't know it yet, but the foundation of her future empire was already taking shape on diner tips, sleepless nights, and the ink of a battered notebook. The struggle defined her, but it didn't destroy her. And sometimes that's enough to keep moving forward. The contraction started far too early. Evelyn Carter had known something wasn't right, for days her back ached constantly. Her ankles were swollen beyond recognition, and every step felt heavier than the last. Still, she had pushed herself, working shifts at the diner until her manager finally sent her home, muttering that she looked ready to pop. She was only 7 months along. The babies weren't supposed to come yet. One icy March morning, the pain sharpened, stabbing across her lower belly until she could barely breathe. She tried to convince herself it was false labor, that if she just rested, it would pass. But within hours, the contractions grew stronger, closer together. Fear shot through her. She dialed a cab with trembling fingers, clutching the small hospital bag she had barely packed. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the driver rushed her through the slush-covered streets to Boston General Hospital. The delivery was fast and terrifying. Nurses crowded around, their voices urgent but calm, explaining that premature twins often needed help breathing, that she shouldn't panic, that they would do everything they could. Evelyn cried out in pain, clutching the sheets, her mind a blur of fear and exhaustion. After what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes, she heard the thin, high-pitched cry of one baby, then another. Relief surged through her, quickly followed by dread as both cries sputtered, then weakened. She caught only a fleeting glimpse of tiny, fragile bodies, so impossibly small, their skin tinged red, their chests rising and falling with effort before they were whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit. "Girls," a nurse whispered gently, touching Evelyn's hand. "Two beautiful baby girls, Clara and Charlotte." She had whispered the names to herself for months, testing the way they sounded together, the way they belonged. Now those names belonged to two lives fighting for survival inside clear plastic incubators. The NICU became her new world. Machines beeped steadily. Wires and tubes crisscrossed her daughter's fragile bodies. Clara was just over 3 pounds, Charlotte barely 2.5. They wore tiny knit caps provided by volunteers, the only softness in a sea of sterile equipment. Evelyn stood by their incubators for hours, pressing her palm against the clear surface, whispering through the glass, "I'm here, my loves. Mama's here." She sang lullabies under her breath, the same songs her own mother used to sing on long car rides. The baby's eyelids fluttered, their tiny fingers curling and uncurling, as if they could somehow sense her presence. Every day was a test of endurance. Evelyn divided her time between working shifts to pay for rent and sitting at the hospital. She lived on black coffee and vending machine granola bars, her body still aching from childbirth. At night, when she finally lay on the stiff cot in the NICU family lounge, she prayed, She wasn't sure who she was praying to anymore. God, the universe, her father's memory, but her words spilled out all the same. Please, let them live. Take whatever you want from me. Just let them live. Medical bills piled quickly, each envelope stamped urgent. Evelyn learned to push down the panic that rose in her chest when she opened them. She asked about payment plans, applied for assistance programs, filled out endless forms. Pride no longer had any place in her life. All that mattered was keeping Clara and Charlotte alive. There were moments of despair, watching her baby struggle for every breath while other parents came and went with healthy newborns felt like a cruel twist of fate. More than once she left the NICU to cry in the stairwell, her body shaking with sobs, afraid her daughters would sense her weakness. But when she returned to their sides and saw their tiny chests rise and fall, fragile but determined, something inside her steadied. If they could fight this hard to stay, then so could she. Weeks passed. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the NICU, the change of shifts, the quiet hours, the way the lights dimmed at night to mimic a womb. She learned to scrub her hands until they were raw, to move carefully among the wires, to cradle her daughters skin to skin when nurses allowed. Those moments, when Clara's head rested beneath her chin, when Charlotte's tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb, were sacred. Their eyes sometimes opened, cloudy blue like her own. Each gaze pierced through her exhaustion and loneliness, reminding her why she endured. Evelyn often spoke to them, even when she knew they couldn't understand. She told them stories of the seaside town where she grew up, of her father teaching her how to ride a bike, of her mother's stubborn laugh. She told them about strength, about resilience, about how sometimes life tried to break you, but you had to bend instead. She told them, over and over, you are wanted, you are loved, don't ever doubt that. The isolation weighed heavily. Friends drifted away, too busy with their own lives to sit in a hospital room day after day. Richard never called, never asked, never appeared. Evelyn stopped hoping he might. She accepted that her daughter's father would remain a ghost, someone who had the power to create life, but not the courage to embrace it. She chose not to dwell on the bitterness, because bitterness couldn't warm her daughter's hands. Only love could. One evening, near midnight, Evelyn sat by Clara's incubator, the soft glow of monitors illuminating her face. She pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering a promise she had repeated countless times. I'll never leave you, not ever. You're my whole world now. Clara's tiny fist lifted, as if in answer, across the room. Charlotte stirred in her sleep, her chest rising steadily. Evelyn smiled through tears. The world outside might see failure, a single mother clinging to survival. But in that room, she felt like the richest woman alive. The NICU nurses began to call her the quiet one, the mother who rarely complained, who read medical textbooks between feedings, who asked thoughtful questions about every machine and medication. They didn't know that she was studying with more than curiosity. In the back of her mind, the scribbled notes in her worn spiral notebook were taking shape. She saw inefficiencies, delays, flaws in the way data was tracked, and she imagined, even in those sleepless hours, how she could build something better. Hope, fragile as her daughter's breaths, found its way into code and diagrams. Still, the nights were lonely. Evelyn sometimes looked out the hospital window, the Boston skyline glowing against the dark sky, and felt as if the entire world moved on without her. But then she turned back to her daughters, to their tiny bodies encased in light, and realized she wasn't left behind. She was exactly where she needed to be. Clara and Charlotte's eyes became her compass, her anchor, her strength. No matter how small, no matter how fragile, they carried the power to keep her standing when everything else had tried to break her. The first night home from the hospital, Evelyn barely slept. Clara and Charlotte, both still impossibly small, cried in turns, their fragile lungs filling the apartment with sounds both pitiful and miraculous. She moved between their cribs like a shadow, bottle in one hand, a blanket in the other. By dawn, Her body ached with exhaustion. Yet in the quiet lull between their cries, she caught herself smiling. They were here. They were alive. That was enough. But survival had a price. Medical bills kept arriving, each stamped with balance due. Evelyn's diner wages covered rent and groceries, but little else. She clipped coupons, reused baby clothes from donation bins, and stretched formula as far as it could go. Even so, she knew the math didn't add up. 2 growing girls would need more than she could provide on tips and part-time data entry. Something had to change. One evening, as the girls slept, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with her battered notebook open in front of her. The scribbles she had made in the NICU still filled the page's diagrams. Notes about hospital inefficiencies, ideas about a better way to track patients and medications. She traced her finger over the words she had written at the top. Meditrack. It felt both ridiculous and essential. Who was she to think she could build something like that? And yet, the idea refused to leave her. She opened her laptop and searched for Learn Coding online. Hundreds of results appeared. Most cost money she didn't have, but she found a free program offering lessons in basic programming. Evelyn clicked Enroll. The first lessons were simple, explaining loops, variables, and functions. Yet to Evelyn, who hadn't touched anything technical since high school, it felt like stepping into a new language. She typed out sample codes while listening for her daughter's cries. Some nights she managed only 10 minutes before exhaustion dragged her under. Other nights, she forced herself awake with lukewarm coffee, whispering encouragement to herself as she typed line after line of practice code. The apartment became a rhythm of motherhood and quiet determination. By day, Evelyn rocked her daughters, fed them, changed diapers, and whispered lullabies. By night, she sat in the glow of her laptop, eyes gritty, fingers fumbling across the keyboard. More than once, she woke to find she had dozed off mid-lesson, a string of nonsense letters filling the screen. She would laugh weakly, delete the gibberish, and start again. Fear was a constant companion. What if I can't learn this? What if I waste time that should go to my daughters? What if I fail? Yet every time doubt threatened to overwhelm her. She looked at Clara and Charlotte, their tiny hands curled tightly around her finger, as if to remind her that failure wasn't an option. I have to try, she whispered. For you. Weeks stretched into months. Evelyn's code improved slowly, painfully. She celebrated small victories, a program that calculated numbers correctly, a form that actually displayed on a screen. She marked each success in her notebook with exclamation marks, small sparks of progress in an otherwise grueling routine. One late night, while the girls slept soundly, Evelyn returned to her NICU notes. She began sketching a design for what Meditrack might look like: a simple interface, boxes for patient data, reminders for medication. It wasn't fancy, but it was clear. She realized with a jolt that this wasn't just a dream scribbled in desperation, it could be real. She started building her first demo. It was clumsy, full of bugs, and far from professional. More than once, the program crashed, leaving her staring at a blank screen in frustration. She slammed her fist lightly against the table, tears welling. "I can't do this," she muttered. But then Clara stirred in her crib, a soft cry cutting through the night. Evelyn rose to soothe her, rocking her gently until she settled. As she laid her daughter back down, Evelyn caught sight of the laptop, glowing faintly across the room. She thought of the promise she had made in the NICU, and she returned to the table. Each fix, each adjustment, each small breakthrough stitched her confidence back together. She learned to debug with patience, to search forums for advice, to celebrate the little wins. Slowly, the demo began to take shape. Boxes appeared where patient data could be entered. Alerts popped up when medications were overdue. A login page appeared, crude but functional. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was something tangible, a foundation. When the program finally ran without crashing, Evelyn sat back in her chair, stunned. She covered her mouth with her hands, laughter and tears spilling together. The girls slept on, unaware that their mother had just built the first fragile piece of a future none of them could yet imagine. The next morning, Evelyn fed her daughters while the laptop screen still glowed faintly in the background. "See that? Clara. See that? Charlotte," she whispered. "That's ours. That's the start of something." She kissed their foreheads and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the impossible wasn't so impossible after all. The world still saw her as a struggling single mother in a rundown apartment. But Evelyn knew better. She had taken her first step, and though the path ahead was steep, it was real, and she was walking it for them. The apartment building where Evelyn lived wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, cracked stair rails, a mailbox that never locked properly, but sometimes comfort hides in the most unexpected corners. For Evelyn, comfort arrived in the form of Mrs. Margaret Turner, the neighbor 2 doors down. Mrs. Turner was in her late 60s, widowed, with silver hair always pinned neatly and a soft cardigan no matter the season. She had lived in the building for more than 30 years and knew every creak in its old floorboards. Their first real conversation happened one afternoon when Evelyn struggled up the stairs with grocery bags in both hands and 2 squirming infants strapped in a double carrier across her chest. Mrs. Turner appeared at her door, eyebrows raised. "Child, you're about to collapse," she said firmly. Without waiting for permission, she took one of the grocery bags and followed Evelyn inside. From that day on, she became a quiet but steady presence in their lives. Mrs. Turner loved babies. She offered to hold Clara or Charlotte so Evelyn could fold laundry or take a quick shower. Sometimes she would arrive with homemade soup, claiming she had made too much again. Evelyn suspected the woman cooked extra on purpose. At first, Evelyn resisted accepting help. Pride was a stubborn shield, but Mrs. Turner's kindness wore her down. One evening, as the older woman gently rocked Clara to sleep, Evelyn whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how I'd manage without you." Mrs. Turner only smiled. "No one manages alone. Dear, don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It was a simple truth, but it struck Evelyn deeply. For months, she had carried the weight of everything by herself, believing that asking for help was weakness. Now, with Mrs. Turner's steady hands and calm voice nearby, she realized strength sometimes meant letting others step in. Encouraged, Evelyn sought support beyond the apartment walls. She found a flyer at the local library advertising a support group for single mothers at a nearby community center. For weeks, she debated going. What if they judged her? What if she didn't belong? But one rainy Thursday, curiosity won out. She bundled the girls into their stroller and walked the 3 blocks to the center. The group met in a brightly lit room, filled with folding chairs and the smell of cheap coffee. A dozen women sat in a circle, some cradling babies, others with toddlers playing at their feet. The facilitator, a warm-eyed woman named Angela, welcomed Evelyn with no questions asked. At first, Evelyn only listened. She heard stories of women abandoned by partners, women juggling jobs and school, women who knew the exhaustion of rocking a baby at 3 a.m., and the fear of bills piling higher than paychecks. Their stories were different in detail, but the same in weight. And slowly, Evelyn began to speak too. She told them about the night Richard handed her life back to her in the form of a severance and a check she refused to cash. She told them about the NICU, the fear of watching her daughters fight to breathe. The women nodded, understanding in their eyes. No pity, just recognition. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel invisible. She wasn't a mistake or a scandal. She was one of many women who had been pushed aside but chose to stand anyway. The group became a lifeline. They shared tips where to find affordable diapers, how to cook 3 meals from 1 roast chicken, which clinics offered the best care without draining your wallet. More than that, they shared encouragement. When Evelyn shyly mentioned her coding lessons, one woman exclaimed, "That's incredible. You're building a future not just for you, but for all of us who dream bigger than survival." The room erupted in supportive murmurs, and Evelyn left that night with her head higher than it had been in months. Kindness also came from strangers. At the diner, regular customers began noticing her perseverance. One retired teacher always left a generous tip with a note that read, "For the twins." A young college student offered to babysit for free once a week, so Evelyn could study without interruption. At first, Evelyn hesitated. Trust didn't come easy, but the gestures reminded her that not everyone looked at her with judgment. Some saw her effort, her resilience, and chose to honor it. Still, pride and doubt battled inside her. Nights found her sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the soft sounds of her daughter's breathing in the background. She coded line after line, often breaking off to warm bottles or change diapers. Exhaustion pressed on her shoulders, and the question circled endlessly. Am I enough on those nights? She would hear Mrs. Turner's voice echo in her memory. No one manages alone, and she would remember the circle of women at the community center, their nods of solidarity, their laughter amid struggle. Slowly, Evelyn began to believe she wasn't as alone as she thought. One afternoon, as she pushed the stroller down the sidewalk, a breeze lifted the curls on Charlotte's head. Clara giggled, reaching out to grab her sister's hand. Evelyn stopped, watching them cling to each other, tiny fingers intertwined. Her chest swelled. These girls were her reason, her anchor. But beyond them, she now had something else, a web of hands, small but steady, holding her up when she stumbled. Later that evening, she wrote in her notebook, beneath a diagram, for Meditrack, strength doesn't come from walking alone. It comes from knowing others walk beside you. It wasn't just words. It was a truth she had begun to live. The world hadn't changed overnight. The bills still came. The apartment was still drafty. The radiator still hissed. And the future remained uncertain. But Evelyn carried herself differently. She had allies, however small the circle, and that made the weight of her burden feel lighter. Maybe, she whispered to her reflection one night, I'm not as alone as I thought. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. The code finally ran without breaking. Evelyn sat back in her chair, blinking at the glowing screen in disbelief. After months of long nights, countless errors, and more than a few tears, her demo program actually opened. The login page appeared, a patient record form displayed. The alert system pinged when she entered medication at the wrong time. It was basic, clunky, and not nearly professional, but it worked. Meditrack had taken its first breath. Her daughters were asleep in their cribs, their soft breathing filling the small apartment. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, laughter and relief spilling out all at once. For so long, everything in her life had felt temporary, fragile, uncertain. But this was real. This was something she had built with her own two hands, in the stolen hours between shifts and feedings. The next morning, Evelyn printed a few pages of screenshots from her program and tucked them into her notebook. It was silly, paper proof of something digital, but holding the pages gave her courage. She carried them with her to the support group at the community center. When the women asked how she was doing, she hesitated, then spread the papers out on the table. It's nothing big, she said shyly. Just a demo, but it works. The circle leaned in, murmuring with interest. One woman clapped softly. Another reached over and squeezed her hand. It's not nothing. Angela, the facilitator, said warmly, it's a beginning. Beginnings matter. That encouragement pushed Evelyn to take the next step. She reached out to a small community hospital she had once visited during her diner shifts. An older nurse there had once slipped her free formula when money was tight. Evelyn emailed her with a simple question. Would your department be willing to test a small software program for tracking patient medications? To her surprise, the nurse responded within days. The hospital's record system was outdated, prone to errors. They were always short on funds, but eager for solutions. We can't pay you yet, the nurse wrote, but if you'd like us to try it, well, give feedback. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read the message. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't money. But it was a chance, her very first. Setting up the pilot was nerve-wracking. She spent hours preparing, fixing bugs, and praying the program wouldn't crash in front of real medical staff. On the morning of the trial, she dropped Clara and Charlotte off with Mrs. Turner, who promised to spoil them with applesauce and lullabies. Evelyn dressed in her best blouse, hand-me-down, pressed carefully, and took the bus to the hospital, her notebook clutched like armor. Walking into the staff room, she felt every eye on her. She introduced Meditrack with a shaky voice, explaining how it could reduce errors and save time. She demonstrated how to log in, how to record medications, how alerts appeared automatically. The nurses leaned closer, curiosity sparking in their tired faces. They peppered her with questions, pointing out improvements she hadn't thought of. Evelyn scribbled notes furiously, nodding at every suggestion. By the end of the session, the head nurse smiled. It's rough around the edges, but it's clever. You're onto something. Evelyn? Those words lit a fire in her chest. She left the hospital walking taller than she had in years. For the first time, her idea had stepped into the real world and survived. Back home, she found Mrs. Turner rocking Charlotte while Clara played with blocks on the rug. Clara looked up, her eyes bright, and toddled toward Evelyn on unsteady legs. Then, with surprising clarity, she said it, "Mama." The sound stopped Evelyn cold. Her throat tightened, eyes flooding with tears. She knelt and scooped Clara into her arms, holding her close. "Say it again," she whispered, laughing through her sobs. Clara patted her cheek and repeated, "Mama." Charlotte squealed as if to join the celebration. Evelyn held both girls, heart swelling. In that moment, the success at the hospital and the word on Clara's lips merged into one truth: she was moving forward, slowly, painfully, but forward. That night, Evelyn sat at her laptop again. The hospital feedback filled her notebook margins, and she set to work fixing bugs, improving the interface, refining every detail. But this time, coding didn't feel like grasping at an impossible dream. It felt like building a bridge, one line at a time, toward a future that was inching closer. The world outside still saw her as a struggling single mother in a shabby apartment. But Evelyn knew different. She was the creator of something new. She was the mother of two bright, growing girls. She was more than survival. She was building. The small wins mattered. They were the proof that the impossible was not beyond her reach. The invitation had come through a friend of a friend, one of the women from the single mothers group whose cousin worked in finance. "He listens to people," she had said. "He doesn't just throw money around, but if he sees potential, he invests. You should try." That was how Evelyn Carter found herself clutching a manila folder with Meditrack printouts, riding the bus across town to a gleaming office building where she had no business being. Her palms were slick, her stomach knotted, and yet a small voice inside whispered, "This is it. This could change everything." She had nothing polished to wear. The navy dress hanging in her closet was 4 years old. It seems a little frayed, but she ironed it carefully the night before. She paired it with a second-hand blazer that didn't quite match. Looking in the mirror that morning, she thought she resembled someone trying too hard to look professional. But when Clara tugged on her sleeve and Charlotte reached for her hand, she forced herself to smile. "Wish me luck. Girls. Mama's got a big day." The office tower was all glass and steel, intimidating in its shine. Evelyn walked through the revolving doors, heels clicking against marble floors, clutching her folder like a lifeline. She checked in with reception, her voice barely steady, then rode the elevator up to the 20th floor. Every ding of the passing floors made her heart thump louder. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area where everything looked expensive: leather chairs, abstract paintings, even the scent of polished wood. A tall man in his early 50s approached with a firm but not unfriendly expression. He had sharp blue eyes, salt and pepper hair, and the kind of presence that filled the room. "Ms. Carter?" he asked. "Yes," she said, rising quickly. Her knees trembled, but she extended her hand. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Blake." Thomas Blake, one of Boston's most respected angel investors, shook her hand firmly. "Let's hear what you've got." The conference room felt cavernous. Evelyn set up her papers, opened her laptop, and launched into her presentation. At first, her voice wavered, too soft against the silence of the polished room. She described the chaos she had seen in the hospital, the misplaced charts, the late medications, the risks that came from outdated systems. Her hands trembled as she clicked through slides, the borrowed blazer slipping slightly off her shoulder. Thomas leaned back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Evelyn felt sweat bead at her temples. For a moment, panic clawed at her. He thinks him foolish. He sees a desperate woman, not an innovator. Then she caught herself. She thought of Clara saying mama. She thought of Charlotte's, laughter echoing in their tiny apartment. She thought of the nights coding at the kitchen table, the endless hours, the promise she had whispered to her daughters in the NICU. "I'll fight for you." Her voice steadied, her back straightened. She no longer spoke with fear, but with conviction. Meditrack can reduce medication errors by up to 40%. It can save hospitals money. But more importantly, it can save lives. I know because I lived through the consequences of a broken system. My daughters spent weeks in NICU. I saw firsthand how every delay, every mistake, could mean the difference between life and death. I'm not here to chase profit. I'm here to fix a problem that should never exist. For the first time, Thomas's gaze sharpened. He leaned forward. "And how do you plan to scale it?" Evelyn's pulse raced, but she answered clearly. She explained her roadmap, a pilot program with a community hospital, feedback integration, a subscription model affordable for smaller facilities. She spoke about partnerships, about the potential for expansion into rural clinics. The words poured out of her, not rehearsed but lived, born from sleepless nights and relentless hope. When she finished, silence stretched. Evelyn stood frozen, unsure if she had impressed him or embarrassed herself. Thomas tapped a finger on the table, then finally spoke. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago," he said quietly. Hungry, determined, unwilling to take no for an answer. He studied her for a long moment. "Your software needs refinement. Your pitch needs polish, but your conviction." He nodded once. "That's the real deal." Her breath caught. "Does that mean I'll invest?" he said simply. 500,000. Enough to hire a team, get a professional prototype, and secure your first contracts. But more than money, I'll mentor you. You've got something here. Evelyn, don't waste it. The words barely registered at first. She stared at him, stunned, as if her ears had tricked her. 500,000? Yes. He smiled faintly at her disbelief. Don't look so surprised. You earned it today. Evelyn shook his hand, her own trembling with shock. Somehow she managed polite thank yous, gathered her things, and made her way out of the building in a daze. On the bus ride home, reality crashed over her. She gripped the folder against her chest, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears spilled down her cheeks. She covered her face with one hand, sobbing quietly as strangers politely averted their eyes. For the first time, she wasn't crying from despair. She was crying because the impossible had cracked open. A door she thought forever closed had swung wide. For the first time since Richard had thrown her out, Evelyn saw not just survival, but a future, a real future, for herself and her daughters. When she reached her stop, she wiped her face, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "It's beginning," and deep inside, she believed it. The papers were signed on a rainy morning in April. Evelyn Carter sat across from Thomas Blake's attorney, her hand trembling slightly as she scrawled her name across the documents. With each signature, Meditrack was no longer just a late-night project on a battered laptop. It was becoming something bigger, something real. Carter Systems, LLC. She whispered the name to herself as she left the law office, clutching the folder of official documents against her chest. Carter Systems wasn't just a company. It was a promise to Clara, to Charlotte, and to the woman she had become through fire and struggle. The first office wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was a cramped suite above a bakery in a half-forgotten corner of Boston. The paint peeled in places, the carpet smelled faintly of yeast, and the furniture consisted of mismatched desks scavenged from thrift shops. But when Evelyn walked in on that first day, she felt a surge of pride. To her, the scuffed walls and humming fluorescent lights were symbols of possibility. Thomas had insisted she couldn't build Meditrack alone. With his investment, she hired her first employees, a young programmer fresh out of MIT named Daniel Kim, and a project coordinator, Rachel Green, who had once managed patient records at a hospital and knew the frustrations Evelyn wanted to solve. Neither came for the salary, which was modest, but because they believed in Evelyn's vision. On their first morning together, Evelyn gathered them around the single conference table, a piece of plywood balanced on file cabinets. "We don't have much," she admitted, "but what we have is a chance. Meditrack isn't just about software. It's about saving lives, about giving nurses and doctors better tools so no parent has to sit helpless while their child's chart gets lost in a stack of papers." Her voice wavered, but her eyes blazed with conviction. Rachel nodded firmly. Daniel smiled and said, "Let's build it." And so they did. Days bled into nights as they coded, tested, and argued over features. Evelyn worked side by side with them, learning as she went, leading not by expertise but by determination. She brought in donuts from the bakery downstairs when money allowed, and sometimes homemade sandwiches when it didn't. They laughed over bugs that made the program crash in ridiculous ways, cheered when an alert finally triggered correctly, and covered the peeling walls with whiteboards full of diagrams. Outside the office, Evelyn's world was equally demanding. Clara and Charlotte had just turned 4, ready to start preschool. Evelyn walked them to the community program each morning, holding their small hands as they chattered about crayons and story time. She kissed their cheeks, reminded them to be kind, and then rushed to the office with her heart split between two worlds. At night, when she picked them up, the teachers reported with admiration how quickly the girls learned. Clara, curious and bold, asked endless questions. Charlotte, thoughtful and meticulous, organized blocks by color and corrected her classmates gently when they miscounted. Evelyn's chest swelled with pride each time she heard it. Her daughters weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The balance was never easy. There were nights Evelyn fell asleep at her desk in the office, her cheek pressed against code printouts. There were mornings she braided Clara's hair with one hand while answering emails with the other. Mrs. Turner still helped when she could, cooking dinners or watching the girls during late meetings. And through it all, Evelyn carried the weight of being both mother and CEO. Thomas visited often, sometimes unannounced, to check progress. At first, Evelyn braced for criticism, but his feedback was direct and constructive. He pushed her to refine her pitch, to think about scalability, to prepare not just for survival, but for growth. After one particularly grueling review, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You've got grit, Evelyn. Don't ever lose it. That's rarer than capital." The first real breakthrough came when Carter Systems signed a pilot contract with a mid-sized hospital outside the city. It wasn't much money, but it was legitimacy. The day the contract arrived, Rachel brought in a bottle of sparkling cider, and the three of them toasted in paper cups. Evelyn raised hers high. "To Carter Systems," she said, her voice thick with emotion. From nothing to something. Momentum began to build. Word spread through hospital circles about the scrappy little startup with an unusually personal story behind its software. A few smaller clinics expressed interest. Evelyn found herself fielding calls she never expected, her inbox filling with possibilities. The office buzzed with energy. Yet, amid the whirlwind, Evelyn never forgot the quiet moments that mattered most. One evening, after a long day of debugging and meetings, She came home to find Clara and Charlotte waiting at the kitchen table with construction paper and crayons. "We made something for you." "Mama," Clara announced proudly. They held up a picture of a tall building with stick figures inside. Above it, in crooked letters, they had written Carter Systems. Evelyn laughed and cried at the same time, pulling them into her arms. "That's perfect," she whispered. "That's exactly what we're building." For the first time since Richard had cast her aside, Evelyn felt not just hope, but momentum. Carter Systems wasn't just a dream anymore. It was alive, growing, fueled by the belief of a few young workers, the faith of one seasoned investor, and the love of two little girls who called her Mama. And though the road ahead would be full of obstacles, Evelyn felt steady in her resolve. She had climbed from the ashes of humiliation to build something entirely her own. And with every line of code, every signed contract, and every bedtime story whispered to Clara and Charlotte, she knew this was just the beginning. 2 years after signing their very first pilot contract, Carter Systems was no longer a scrappy dream above a bakery. The peeling paint and flickering lights of that first office had been replaced by a modest but professional space downtown. The new office still wasn't flashy. Second-hand desks and thrift store chairs filled most rooms, but it hummed with energy. A dozen employees now filled the space, their conversations overlapping in bursts of technical jargon and laughter. Hospitals had begun to take notice. What started with one mid-sized facility soon grew into contracts with some of Boston's larger networks. By the end of the year, Carter Systems had its software running in 5 hospitals and dozens of smaller clinics across Massachusetts. The numbers on Evelyn's spreadsheets no longer caused dread, but cautious hope. Revenue was growing. The company was solvent. Evelyn stood at the window of her office one afternoon, looking out over the city she had once walked through in fear and anonymity. The same skyline that had loomed over her when she carried her daughters home from the NICU now felt like a landscape she belonged in. Still, even as pride swelled in her chest, a quiet ache lingered. Her past was never far away. Richard's face sometimes appeared in her dreams, smug and dismissive, telling her she didn't belong. Even in success, those words echoed. The world was starting to call her CEO, but a part of her still carried the memory of being escorted out of his office, pregnant and humiliated. The media, however, saw only the triumph. A local paper ran a feature calling her the single mom CEO who's changing healthcare. The article included a photo of her with Clara and Charlotte, both now 5 years old, their matching curls tied back with ribbons. The story spread quickly, and suddenly Evelyn's phone rang with interview requests. She learned to answer questions carefully, to present herself as polished but relatable. She never mentioned Richard by name, though the shadow of him hovered over every headline. At home, life remained as grounded as ever. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn stood in her small kitchen with Clara and Charlotte perched on stools beside her. The 3 of them were elbow deep in the flour, attempting to bake chocolate chip cookies. Clara insisted on pouring the sugar herself, spilling half across the counter. Charlotte carefully measured the vanilla extract with the seriousness of a chemist. Evelyn laughed, brushing flour from her daughter's cheeks. Between mixing and baking, her phone buzzed with messages from potential clients. She answered quickly, balancing professionalism with the sticky hands of motherhood. "Yes, Carter Systems can schedule a demo next Thursday," she said into the phone, while simultaneously guiding Charlotte's hand to stir the dough. "Of course, I'll send over the updated proposal tonight." When she hung up, Clara wrinkled her nose. "Mama, you're always working." Evelyn knelt, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "I know, sweetheart. But do you remember what I told you? Every line of code, every phone call, it's all building a future for you and your sister." Charlotte piped up, spoon in hand. "Then we're helping too, right? Because we're making cookies while you work." Evelyn laughed, pulling them both close. "Exactly. Team Carter." The cookies turned out lopsided, half undercooked and half too crisp, but the 3 of them ate them warm from the oven, giggling as chocolate smeared their lips. For Evelyn, it was a reminder success wasn't measured only in contracts and revenue. It was also found in these messy, joy-filled moments at home. Still, when night fell and the girls were tucked into bed, Evelyn often sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the framed article that called her Single Mom CEO. The pride was real, but so was the hollowness. Public recognition didn't erase the private wounds. Richard had never acknowledged their daughters, never apologized, never seen the brilliance of Clara and Charlotte as they learned to read and painted colorful pictures for the fridge. His absence was both a relief and a scar. She whispered to herself in the quiet, "I've built this without him. I've proven he was wrong." But why does it still hurt? The answer never came easily. Trauma had a way of lingering. Even when victory followed, Evelyn carried that weight into every boardroom, every interview, every quiet night when the city outside glowed with possibilities. But each morning, when Clara and Charlotte burst into her room with their boundless energy, Evelyn remembered what mattered most. The world could call her whatever it wanted: CEO, pioneer, success story. To her daughters, she was simply Mama, and that title carried more power than any headline. The email arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Evelyn skimmed the words once, then twice, her breath catching in her throat. "We are pleased to invite Carter Systems to present at the National Health Tech Conference in Boston." Boston, the city she had fled years ago, carrying newborn twins and the shards of a broken life. The city where she had been fired, humiliated, and discarded. Now it was inviting her back not as a secretary, not as a woman pushed aside, but as the CEO of a rising company. She stared at the screen, torn between triumph and dread. Thomas Blake would surely insist she attend. It was the biggest stage in the industry, a chance to showcase Meditrack before hundreds of investors, hospital administrators, and policymakers. But for Evelyn, it was more than a conference. It was a confrontation with ghosts she had carefully avoided. That evening, she gathered Clara and Charlotte at the kitchen table, where crayons and half-finished homework pages cluttered the surface. "Girls," she said softly, "we've been invited to a special trip. Mama has to give a speech at a big conference in Boston." Charlotte tilted her head, curious. "Boston. Where's that, Clara?" Always quicker with memory. Frowned. "Isn't that where we were born?" The question pierced straight through Evelyn's chest. She forced a smile, her throat tight. "Yes, sweetheart." "That's where you were born." Clara's eyes widened. "Mama, will we see the place?" "The hospital. Where we started." Evelyn hesitated, the air suddenly heavy. Memories flooded back, the sterile NICU, the beeping machines, the fear of losing them, the loneliness of walking out of that city with nothing but desperation and determination. She reached across the table, taking Clara's small hand in hers. "Maybe," she whispered. "Well, see." The girls clapped with excitement at the thought of a plane ride in a new city. Evelyn excused herself to the kitchen, leaning against the counter as her breath shook. She wasn't just planning a business trip. She was preparing to face the place that had nearly destroyed her. Travel preparations buzzed through the Carter Systems office for weeks. Rachel coordinated logistics. Daniel fine-tuned Meditrack's latest demo, and Thomas arranged meetings with potential investors who would also attend the conference. Everyone understood the significance of the event. Evelyn, however, felt the weight differently. Each hotel booking, each printed agenda, felt like a step closer to reopening wounds she thought had scarred over. On the day of departure, the girls could hardly contain their excitement. They clutched matching backpacks, stuffed with coloring books and snacks, as they boarded the flight. Evelyn guided them to their seats, her hand steady though her heart pounded. The hum of the engines, the rush of takeoff. She stared out the window as the city below shrank, whispering silently, "I'm not the same woman who left." Hours later, the plane descended over Boston. The skyline rose into view, glittering in the afternoon sun. Clara pressed her face to the glass. "Mama, look, is that it? Is that our city?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Yes, Clara, that's Boston. Charlotte leaned over her sister's shoulder. It's beautiful. Evelyn wanted to agree, but all she saw were shadows, the revolving doors that had closed on her, the cold rain as she stood jobless, the hospital where she had prayed for her daughters' fragile lives. Her hands gripped the armrest until her knuckles whitened. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. This time, she reminded herself, she was arriving not in defeat, but in power. The conference hotel was bustling when they arrived. Industry leaders filled the lobby, their badges swinging from lanyards. Cameras flashed, journalists hovered, conversations buzzed with talk of innovations and deals. Evelyn checked in under Evelyn Carter, CEO, Carter Systems. Her daughters marveled at the grandeur of the hotel. "Mama, it's so big," Charlotte exclaimed, twirling in the lobby until her backpack nearly slipped off. Clara tugged on Evelyn's sleeve, pointing toward the tall glass windows. "Can we see the hospital tomorrow?" Please, the request hit harder than Evelyn expected. She knelt to her daughter's level, brushing a curl from Clara's forehead. "Well, see what we can do. It's an important place. It's where our story began." What she didn't say was how much it frightened her, the thought of walking those halls again, of seeing the NICU where she had once whispered desperate prayers. But she also knew her daughters had a right to know their beginnings, however painful. That evening, Evelyn sat alone by the window of the hotel suite after the girls had fallen asleep, their small bodies curled under blankets. She looked out at the city lights flickering against the night sky. It struck her how different this moment was from her last time here. Then, she had been invisible, dismissed, and left with nothing. Now, she had returned with her daughters by her side and her company's name on the conference agenda. Still, her chest ached with unspoken questions. Would facing this city bring closure or reopen wounds she wasn't ready to confront? Could she walk into those conference halls with her head high? Knowing the ghosts of her past might still linger in the crowd, she pressed her hand against the glass, watching her reflection overlay the city skyline. "I'm not the same Evelyn," she whispered, "and this time, am not alone." Behind her, Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, "Mama?" Evelyn turned, her heart softening at the sight of her daughters, safe and peaceful. Whatever tomorrow held, she would face it for them. The VIP reception glittered atop one of Boston's tallest towers, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the harbor. Chandeliers cast warm light across polished floors, and the air buzzed with polite laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversation. For most, it was an evening of networking and promises. For Evelyn Carter, it was a battlefield dressed in silk and champagne. She had chosen her outfit with precision a tailored emerald green dress that skimmed her figure without apology, paired with modest heels. Her curls framed her face, and a simple gold necklace, a gift from Mrs. Turner, rested at her throat. She wanted to appear calm, assured, and unmistakably in control. Still, as the elevator doors opened and she stepped into the crowd, a flicker of nerves coiled in her stomach. The cameras found her almost instantly. Ms. Carter Evelyn. Over here. Reporters craned their necks, eager to capture the elusive single mom, CEO, whose story had been circulating in the press. Evelyn offered polite smiles. Nothing more. She had no intention of feeding headlines tonight. She mingled with investors and administrators, listening more than she spoke, her posture steady. Every so often, she glanced at her watch, counting down the minutes. She knew he would come. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she felt it in the tightening of her chest, the way the air seemed to shift around her. And then, there he was, Richard Hale. He entered the reception with his usual practiced stride, his tailored navy suit perfect, his expensive watch catching the light. At first glance, he looked unchanged, handsome, confident, the heir to an old money family who had always assumed the world bent to him. But Evelyn noticed the subtle cracks immediately, the slight tension around his mouth. the faint lines etched deeper into his forehead, the way his eyes darted as though searching for approval. Their eyes met across the room. The moment stretched, sharp and silent. She watched recognition dawn in his face, first a flicker of surprise, then disbelief, and finally something closer to panic. His drink trembled almost imperceptibly in his hand. Evelyn, by contrast, lifted her glass of sparkling water and took a measured sip. Never looking away, he approached, though not with the confidence he once had. It was as if his body moved before his mind had decided what to say. "Evelyn," he breathed, stopping a few feet from her. His voice carried both familiarity and shock. She turned as if greeting a casual acquaintance, her smile composed. "Mr. Hale," she said evenly, extending her hand. "It's been a long time." The nearby executives quieted, sensing something unspoken in the air. Richard shook her hand, his grip too firm, almost desperate, as though trying to reassert control. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone wavering between cordial and unsettled. "I was invited," Evelyn replied simply. She let the words hang, then added, "As CEO of Carter Systems." The title landed like a stone in the quiet between them. Richard blinked, his practiced smile faltering. "CEO? Yes." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost curious. "We've been developing MediTrack. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's being implemented in several hospitals across the state." Murmurs rippled through the small circle of listeners. A few executives leaned closer, intrigued. Richard's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh, too brittle to be convincing. Impressive. From secretary to CEO, that's quite the leap. Evelyn's eyes hardened, though her smile never wavered. "Yes, quite. But sometimes the path life sets for us isn't the one others imagine. I've found it's often better." His FOD slipped further. He shifted, adjusting his cufflinks, glancing around as though searching for an escape. Yet leaving would admit defeat. He was trapped, caught between the past he had buried and the present standing before him in emerald green. A bold investor in the group broke the silence. "Wait, you two know each other?" Richard spoke quickly. "Too quickly. Ms. Carter worked briefly at my firm years ago." She was an assistant. Evelyn's gaze didn't flinch. "Executive secretary," she corrected gently. "While completing my graduate work in computer science, though I doubt Mr. Hale recalls much beyond my departure." Richard swallowed, his cheeks coloring. "Well, it seems you've done well for yourself." Evelyn took another sip of her water, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes, Carter Systems is valued at over $100 million now. We've signed contracts with some of the largest hospital networks in New England, and tomorrow, I'll be presenting our vision for national expansion." Her words were not bragging, they were facts, delivered with the steady weight of truth. Richard shifted again, his posture stiff, his mask of composure cracking around the edges. He muttered something about keeping an eye on new ventures, but it fell flat. The executives around them had already registered the power dynamic, their attention turning more toward Evelyn than Richard. For the first time in their lives, he was the one standing in her shadow. Evelyn glanced at her watch, then back at him with polite finality. "If you will excuse me, I have other conversations to attend." She nodded to the group, her smile warm, then turned gracefully, leaving Richard standing alone amid whispers he could not control. As she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble, Evelyn felt her pulse racing. She had faced him not with tears or anger, but with calm authority. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or relive the pain. Her very presence, her success, had been enough. 5 years ago, Richard Hale had dismissed her as nothing more than a mistake to be forgotten. Tonight, she had reminded him, and everyone else, that she was not only unforgettable, but undeniable. The next afternoon, Evelyn arrived at the Boston Convention Center with Clara and Charlotte walking proudly at her sides. They wore matching navy dresses, their curls tied with ribbons that matched Evelyn's emerald scarf. The girls clutched small notebooks and crayons, prepared to sit quietly while their mother handled business. Evelyn had debated whether to bring them into such a public setting. Thomas had warned her, conferences are unpredictable. Evelyn, children complicate optics. But Evelyn knew in her heart this was the right choice. Her daughters were not distractions. They were part of her story, her strength, her truth. She was done hiding them from the world. As they entered the lobby, heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just that Evelyn Carter, the rising star CEO, had arrived. It was that two little girls walked beside her, their caramel-toned skin and striking blue eyes unmistakable. Those eyes mirrored another man in the building. At that very moment, Richard Hale was across the hall, surrounded by colleagues. He was mid-sentence when the whispers reached him. He turned, following the ripple of attention, and froze. Clara and Charlotte. The resemblance was undeniable. The slope of their noses, the set of their jaws, and above all, those blue eyes, his eyes. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his carefully constructed world tilting toward chaos. The girls didn't notice the stares. They were too busy marveling at the scale of the conference center, pointing at the massive banners and glass ceiling. Clara tugged on Evelyn's sleeve. "Mama, it's so big. Is this where you're going to speak?" "Yes, darling," Evelyn said softly, smoothing her daughter's hair. Her tone remained calm, her steps steady, even as she sensed Richard watching from across the room. It was Charlotte who noticed him first. She stopped in her tracks, her gaze locking on Richard. For a moment, she studied him, head tilted as though piecing together a puzzle. Then, in a voice clear enough to carry across the marble floor, she asked, "Mama, is that our daddy?" The air seemed to shatter into silence. Conversations halted, heads turned. The question, innocent and unfiltered, hung in the space like a thunderclap. Evelyn's heart clenched, but she did not flinch. Slowly, she knelt beside her daughters, her hand resting gently on Charlotte's shoulder. She looked at them first, not at Richard. "Yes," she said softly, her voice calm, steady. "That is your father." The silence deepened. Every eye shifted between Evelyn, the twins, and Richard. Richard stood frozen, his expression a storm of disbelief, recognition, and panic. His throat tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. For years, he had buried the past, rationalized it, justified it, locked it away. But here it was, alive and undeniable, staring back at him in the form of two little girls who mirrored his very soul. Clara blinked, processing. "Mama, he looks just like us." "Yes," Evelyn whispered, stroking her cheek. "You carry his eyes." Richard took an involuntary step forward. His voice, when it came, cracked slightly. "They're mine?" Evelyn finally rose to meet his gaze. She did not smile, nor did she show anger. Her face was composed, her tone firm. "Yes. Richard, these are your daughters, Clara and Charlotte." The names seemed to hit him like blows. He repeated them under his breath, as though trying to anchor himself in a reality he hadn't chosen. Clara, Charlotte. Around them, the audience remained transfixed, torn between curiosity and discomfort. No one dared to interrupt. Richard's mind spun in chaos. 5 years collapsed into a single moment, the night of dismissal. The unsigned check, the memory of Evelyn walking out of his office with tears in her eyes. He had told himself she would move on, that whatever had come of it wasn't his responsibility. Now the truth stood before him, undeniable, undeniable in every feature of those children. He tried to speak, but the words choked in his throat. Evelyn did not rescue him. She stood tall, her hands resting lightly on her daughter's shoulders. "You don't need to say anything. Richard, the truth is clear enough." Charlotte's eyes, so earnest, searched his face. "Why didn't you come for us?" The question pierced the air with a child's brutal honesty. Richard felt his composure crumbling. Shame surged like fire in his chest. burning through excuses and defenses. He opened his mouth, closed it again, unable to meet their gaze. Evelyn gently pulled her daughters closer. "Not every answer comes right away," she told them, her tone protective yet tender. "What matters is that you know who you are, and that you are loved." Clara pressed against her mother's side, still staring at Richard with quiet curiosity. Charlotte squeezed Evelyn's hand, as though sensing the heaviness of the moment but not fully understanding. Evelyn turned, guiding them away, her steps measured, her posture strong. She did not rush. She did not hide. She allowed the silence to linger, every pair of eyes in the room witnessing the truth she had carried alone for 5 years. Behind her, Richard remained rooted to the spot, his chest heaving, his face pale. For the first time in his charmed life, he was stripped bare, exposed, not by scandal or rumor, but by the innocent question of a child who bore his face. As the crowd slowly began to stir again, whispers cascading through the hall, Evelyn kept her daughters close. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to Clara's head. "You were brave," she whispered. Clara nodded. "I just wanted to know." "And you had every right to ask," Evelyn said softly. Her heart ached, but she also felt a profound sense of release. She had never wanted revenge, only truth. And now, the truth had been spoken not by her, but by the voices of the very lives she had fought so hard to protect. The headquarters of Harrison Industries stood tall against the Boston skyline, its glass fold gleaming like a fortress of wealth and power. Evelyn Carter had walked through those doors once before, years ago, as a secretary dismissed with humiliation. Today, she returned as the majority shareholder. Her heels clicked against the marble as she entered the lobby, Clara and Charlotte holding Zoe's hands nearby. She had debated leaving the girls at the hotel, but ultimately, she chose otherwise. They deserved to see this moment, to know their mother had not only survived but prevailed. The receptionist, young and wide-eyed, nearly dropped her phone at the sight of them. "Ms. Carter, welcome. The board is assembled on the 30th floor." The elevator ride was silent except for the hum of machinery. Evelyn stood tall, her crimson suit a deliberate choice, bold, commanding, impossible to ignore. The girls, dressed neatly in navy cardigans, looked around with wide eyes. Clara whispered, "Mama, is this where he works?" "Yes," Evelyn said softly, "but after today, things will be different." When the elevator doors opened, the hallway stretched toward the boardroom. Evelyn remembered all too well. The same polished wood, the same heavy double doors, the same weight in her chest. But this time, the fear was gone. Zoe pushed the doors open. Inside, 14 board members sat around a long mahogany table, papers spread before them. At the head stood Richard Hale, mid-presentation, charts flashing on the large screens. His voice faltered the moment he saw her. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp. His eyes darted to the twins, recognition flashing before he quickly masked it. "Why are you here?" "Evelyn." Evelyn walked calmly to the table. "I'm here," she said evenly, "because this is my company now." A ripple of confusion swept through the board. Richard barked a laugh, harsh and hollow. "Your company, don't be absurd." "Security. No need for theatrics," Evelyn interrupted. She gestured to her attorney, who distributed thick folders down the table. "As of this morning, Carter Systems has acquired 52% of Harrison Industries through systematic share purchases." Gasps erupted. Board members flipped through the documents, their faces paling as they scanned signatures, purchase orders, and confirmations. Richard's composure shattered. He slammed a fist on the table. "Lowe's, fabrications, this can't be legal." Walter Grant, the eldest board member, adjusted his glasses as he examined the documents. "It's perfectly legal." Richard, Shaz, the majority shareholder. His voice carried the weight of authority. "She controls this company now." Richard's face flushed crimson. "You can't do this to me. This is my company, my legacy." Evelyn met his rage with calm, her voice steady, almost gentle. "No, Richard, This company was handed to you. You inherited it without ever earning it. And you squandered it. He pointed a trembling finger at her. This is revenge. That's what this is. You're punishing me for the past. Evelyn straightened, her gaze sweeping the room. She placed a hand lightly on Clara's shoulder, grounding herself. Then she spoke, her voice resonant and unshakable. This isn't revenge. This is justice. The words echoed through the boardroom like a gavel strike. Every eye was on her. She continued, 5 years ago, I was escorted out of this building, pregnant, alone, discarded as though I had no value. You thought a check would erase me, Richard, but what you failed to see is that strength doesn't come from privilege or money. It comes from survival, from building when you've been broken, from rising when you've been pushed down. The board sat in stunned silence. Clara and Charlotte watched their mother with wide-eyed pride, sensing the magnitude even if they didn't understand every word. Richard staggered back, his voice cracking. You've manipulated them. You've used our daughters. Evelyn cut him off sharply, her composure finally showing steel. You denied them for 5 years. You ignored every message, every plea. You don't get to call them yours now, not when it suits you. The girls looked at him then, their identical eyes mirroring his. Richard faltered under their gaze, shame radiating off him. Walter Grant cleared his throat. The documentation is clear, effective immediately. Evelyn Carter assumes control as majority shareholder. A new leadership structure must be approved. Several board members nodded, whispering among themselves. It was done. Richard sagged into his chair, fury and humiliation twisting his features. You'll regret this, he spat. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Evelyn gathered the folders neatly, her movements calm. I don't deal in revenge, Richard. I deal in accountability. And Harrison Industries is about to become something better, something worthy of the people it serves. She turned to the board, her tone softening but still firm. I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to rebuild. Together. We can make this company more than a family heirloom. We can make it a force for good. The board members exchanged thoughtful glances, several nodding in agreement. Evelyn reached for Clara and Charlotte's hands. Gentlemen, ladies, she said with quiet finality, this meeting is adjourned. As she walked out, her daughters flanking her. Richard's voice echoed faintly behind them, a roar of a man who had lost everything and had no one to blame but himself. But Evelyn didn't look back. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime. Clara squeezed her hand. Mama, she whispered, you were so brave. Evelyn smiled down at her girls, her eyes misting. No, my loves, we were brave. The boardroom, once Richard's domain, had become a stage for his undoing. After Evelyn's declaration, the members called for a private session. Evelyn waited in the adjoining lounge, her daughters coloring quietly at a low table while Zoe kept them company. The muffled sound of raised voices carried faintly through the door. 20 minutes later, Walter Grant emerged, his silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. Ms. Carter, he said gravely, though there was a trace of respect in his eyes. The board has voted, effective immediately. Richard Hale is removed as Chief Executive Officer. You are to assume leadership as Chairwoman and CEO of the newly structured Carter Harrison Group. For a heartbeat, Evelyn simply stood there, letting the words sink in. Chairwoman, CEO. The building that had once been the scene of her downfall was now under her stewardship. She glanced at her daughters. Clara looked up from her drawing of a house with 3 stick figures inside. Mama, are we going home? Evelyn knelt, pulling both girls into her arms. Yes, sweetheart, we're going home, but this time, it's different. This time, the story is ours. The official announcement swept through the financial world within hours. Headlines splashed across newspapers and business sites. Single mother, CEO, secures. Majority of Harrison Industries. Carter Harrison Group. A new era begins. Some called it a corporate coup. Others hailed it as the boldest leadership transition in decades. Evelyn, however, cared less about the noise. For her, it wasn't about revenge or glory. It was about building something sustainable, something honest, something her daughters could inherit with pride. Yet beneath her triumph simmered a question she couldn't ignore. What role, if any, Richard should have in Clara and Charlotte's lives? That evening, back at the hotel suite, Evelyn stood at the window, staring at the glowing Boston skyline. The twins slept peacefully in the next room, their small breaths steady, their bodies curled beneath matching blankets. She envied their innocence, their ability to sleep through storms. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. "Please, let me see them. Just once. I need to explain." Her chest tightened. She remembered the night he had offered her a check, dismissing her and their unborn children like unwanted burdens. She remembered standing in the rain with nothing but resolve to carry her forward. Part of her wanted to delete the message, to close the door forever. But another part, the mother in her, the woman who had raised two daughters to be kind, even in hardship, hesitated. She turned when Zoe entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You've been standing there for an hour," Zoe said softly. "What's on your mind?" Evelyn took the tea, her hands warming around the ceramic. "He wants to see them. Richard. After everything, he wants to see them." Zoe studied her. "What do you want?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "I want to protect them, to shield them from the pain he caused. But I also know they deserve the truth, and maybe one day they'll want to hear it from him." "You don't owe him forgiveness," Zoe said firmly. "But maybe you owe them the choice." Evelyn exhaled slowly, the weight pressing down on her chest. She knew Zoe was right. 2 days later, in a small private lounge at the hotel, Richard sat nervously on the edge of a chair. He looked different, smaller somehow, his arrogance stripped away. His suit hung looser on his frame, and for once, his watch seemed less like a statement of power and more like a relic of a man trying to hold on. The door opened, and Evelyn entered with Clara and Charlotte. The girls hesitated, clutching her hands. Richard stood immediately, his eyes fixed on them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Clara tilted her head, breaking the silence. "You really are our daddy." Richard's eyes brimmed with tears. He sank to his knees, lowering himself to their level. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm your father, and I've made so many mistakes." Charlotte frowned, her small hands fidgeting. "Why didn't you want us?" Richard's face crumpled. He looked at Evelyn, silently pleading for help, but she stood firm, her arms crossed, offering no lifeline. This was his burden to carry. "I was a coward," he admitted finally, his voice raw. "I thought my reputation, my family's approval, mattered more than doing what was right. I was wrong, terribly wrong, and I am so sorry." The girls studied him quietly. They were too young to understand the layers of betrayal, but old enough to feel the sincerity, or lack of it, in his voice. Clara finally nodded, her expression serious. "Well, let you try. But Mama is our real hero." Tears slipped down Richard's cheeks. He reached out, hesitating, before gently resting a hand on Clara's shoulder. She didn't pull away. Evelyn watched, her emotions a storm beneath her composed surface. Allowing this moment wasn't easy. It went against every instinct to shield her daughters. But she knew this was not about Richard, it was about them, and about the kind of mother she wanted to be. When the meeting ended, Richard left quietly, his figure slumped. Evelyn stood by the door, her daughters hugging her legs. "Mama," Charlotte said softly. He looked sad. "Yes," Evelyn replied, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices they regret. What matters is that we learn from them." Clara looked up at her with bright, steady eyes. "We already have you? That's enough." Evelyn's throat tightened, and she pulled them both close. "You are my everything," she whispered. As she held her daughters, Evelyn felt the circle complete. She had taken back her dignity, her future, her voice. She had turned humiliation into triumph, rejection into justice, and loneliness into legacy. Tomorrow, she would stand before the press as chairwoman of the Carter Harrison Group. But tonight, she was simply a mother, grateful for the two lives who had given her the courage to rise. A full year had passed since the boardroom battle that shook Harrison Industries to its core. Under Evelyn Carter's steady leadership, the newly named Carter Harrison Group had not only stabilized, it had flourished. Contracts expanded across the country. Hospitals praised Meditrack for saving lives and cutting costs. And the company's reputation soared. The Boston headquarters looked different now, too. The cold, austere building that once embodied exclusion had been reimagined. On the floor just below the executive suites, a bright, colorful child care center bustled with activity. Glass walls allowed sunlight to spill into rooms filled with laughter, storybooks, and tiny desks. Employees often paused to wave at their children during the day, something unthinkable under Richard Hale's reign. For Evelyn, this floor was the crown jewel of her leadership. Every time she walked past, she thought of the nights she had rocked Clara and Charlotte to sleep while working at her laptop, alone, unsupported. Now, no mother or father working here would ever face that isolation. At home, Clara and Charlotte had blossomed. At 6 years old, they were bright, curious, and full of opinions. Clara loved science experiments, constantly mixing kitchen ingredients into strange concoctions that left Zoe shaking her head. Charlotte adored reading, her small voice rising proudly as she sounded out longer and longer words. One evening, Evelyn found them in the child care center, building an elaborate tower of blocks. Clara grinned when she saw her. "Mama, when we grow up, can we work here too?" Evelyn knelt, smiling. "You can be anything you want. My loves, this place will always be open to you." Charlotte looked thoughtful. "But we don't have to, right? We can decide for ourselves." Her words caught Evelyn's heart in the best way. She smoothed Charlotte's hair. "Exactly. No one decides your worth, your path, or your future but you." The press still followed Evelyn, fascinated by her journey. She had become an icon, not just in tech, but in the broader cultural conversation, a symbol of resilience, justice, and motherhood turned into leadership. On the anniversary of the takeover, she sat down for an interview with a national magazine. The reporter, a young woman with wide eyes, leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, people call you the woman who rose from nothing to topple a titan. Do you see it that way?" Evelyn smiled gently, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't see myself as someone who rose to destroy him. That was never my goal." She paused, her gaze softening as she thought of her daughters. "I rose to show Clara and Charlotte that no one decides their worth but themselves. Not a man, not a company, not society. Only them." The room fell silent, the reporter blinking quickly as though fighting tears. Evelyn continued, her voice calm yet firm. "My daughters will grow up knowing they are enough, that they are powerful, capable, and free, and I hope the message reaches every woman who has ever been told she is less than she is." Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked back to her corner office. The walls were decorated not with trophies or plaques, but with artwork Clara and Charlotte had made, scribbled rainbows, paper cutouts of dinosaurs, and a finger-painted family portrait. But above her desk hung the most striking display of all, a framed check for $75,000. The check Richard Hale had once handed her as if to erase her life, her dignity, and her children. Beneath it, engraved in brass, were the words, "The price he thought we were worth." Visitors often paused before it, some uncomfortable, others inspired. Evelyn always explained the same way. It's not a reminder of bitterness. It's a reminder of what happens when you refuse to let someone else set your value. A year had given her perspective on Richard, too. He had been stripped of his power, reduced to a non-voting board seat, and forced into therapy as part of his supervised visitation agreement. He saw Clara and Charlotte twice a month, under social worker supervision. The visits were awkward, sometimes painful, but slowly, tiny connections were forming. One rainy Saturday, Clara came home from a visit with a new fact about dinosaurs information Richard had shared. He remembered the one I liked. "Mama," she said softly, almost surprised. Evelyn smiled gently, tucking her daughter's hair behind her ear. Even people who've made mistakes can learn to be better. She did not forgive Richard easily, but she also refused to let her daughters grow up with only anger in their hearts. Her justice had already been served. Now, it was their turn to decide what kind of relationship they wanted with him. On the final evening of that anniversary week, Evelyn sat in her office as twilight spread over Boston. The skyline glowed, the city alive beneath her. She remembered the night she had left on a bus with nothing but determination and two fragile infants. Now, she sat at the helm of a billion-dollar empire, her daughters thriving, her voice unshaken. She opened her journal, the same one she had once filled with scribbled ideas for Meditrack. On the first page, years earlier, she had written one day, "I will build something no one can take away." She smiled, closing the book gently. That promise had been kept. The next morning, Clara and Charlotte came bounding into her room, laughing and giggling. "Mama pancakes," they shouted in unison. Evelyn laughed, pulling them both into her arms. "Yes, pancakes, and then maybe a walk by the harbor. How does that sound?" They nodded eagerly, already debating topping syrup versus strawberries, while Evelyn listened with warmth. She thought of all the battles she had fought, all the nights she had wept, all the doubts that had haunted her, and she thought of how far they had come. It wasn't about Richard anymore. It wasn't even about the company. It was about these two little girls and the world they would inherit, a world where no one could put a price tag on their worth. Evelyn Carter's journey reminds us of a truth many of us learn. Late in life, our worth is not defined by the judgments of others, nor by the hardships that try to break us. Too often, society tells us we are less than too old, too young, too poor, too ordinary. Evelyn was told she was disposable, offered a check as if her dignity could be bought. Yet she chose not to let someone else decide her value. Her story teaches us that resilience is born in the quietest, hardest moments, counting coins to buy milk, whispering prayers beside a hospital crib, or staying up through the night to learn something new. These moments, though small, carry the power to change a life. For those of us who have faced rejection, betrayal, or loss, Evelyn's path is a reminder it is never too late to rise. We cannot erase the past, but we can transform it into strength for the future. And perhaps the greatest legacy we leave, whether for children, grandchildren, or the world itself, is to show, by example, that no one but ourselves defines our worth. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for joining Evelyn Carter's journey of courage and resilience. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of hope, justice, and second chances. Your support means the world, and together, we can keep these stories shining.